Hello, life science. We're going to transition out of the water onto the land with this next class of vertebrates, the amphibians. And we can actually transition from the water to the land during the amphibious life cycle. So let's check that out. The root amphi means both sides of, and the bian part refers to bio, as in life. So amphibian basically just means two sides to life. So the amphibian life cycle usually is going to begin in the water. The development is oviparous and the fertilization is external, which means that by external fertilization, females will lay unfertilized eggs in the water, and then males will come by and fertilize them. Oviparous meaning that the larva will develop in those eggs and then hatch in the water. And of course, if you're going to hatch in the water, that means that you need to be adapted to survive in the water, which means that you would have gills. So the larva will have gills, and when they metamorphose into adults, then they will develop lungs, and even their fins will turn into legs, assuming that they came out with fins. Not all of them do. For example, the larva of a salamander starts out with legs. It basically looks like a miniature version of the adult. It just has gills instead of lungs. The frog larva, on the other hand, is a tadpole. I think we're all pretty familiar with those here in North America. And they kind of look like a bulbous eel, so they undergo a much bigger transformation. So what makes amphibians unique? So they have an endoskeleton made mostly of bone, which you'd expect if they're a class of vertebrates. They have smooth skin with many capillaries and pigments, but no scales. The many capillaries in their skin are important because gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide are able to easily diffuse through those walls and through their skin. They'll have two pairs of limbs with webbed feet, at least usually. And as far as their breathing goes, though they do have gills as larvae, and they do have lungs as adults, their primary means of breathing is through their skin. The lungs and gills are actually just kind of like supplementary. Depending on the species, some frogs also have a mouth lining with a lot of capillaries in the skin that they can use to breathe. Because they absorb oxygen through a variety of means, even the land-dwelling adults are able to spend a lot of time in the water without suffocating. So they also have a three-chambered heart. Now, the details of their circulatory system they're a bit overwhelming. So skipping over all the details, let's just get the big picture. The three chambers are one ventricle and two atria. Now, of the two atria, the left atrium is filled with oxygenated blood from the lungs, mouth, or skin through the pulmonary vein. Okay, so oxygenated blood comes in the left atrium. Now, the right atrium is going to be filled with deoxygenated blood from various organs. These two are both dumped into the ventricle, which sends it out to the rest of the body. And all the blood vessels, they split and they go off to different directions. And, it's all a bunch of confusing Latin names. But the big picture for the three-chambered heart of an amphibian is two kinds of blood come in. Two kinds of blood come in. Oxygenated and deoxygenated. They're both mixed together in the ventricle and then sent back out to the body. Okay, well, that three-chambered heart, by keeping the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood slightly separated, ends up keeping the concentration of oxygen higher. Okay, so what else about amphibians? They're also ectothermic. Remember, that means they're cold-blooded, like fish. When their body temperature drops very low, the chemical reactions that drive their body's function slow down, and this can lead them to hibernate. Hibernation is a state of extremely slow metabolism and respiration accompanied by lower than normal body temperatures. Slow metabolism means a hibernating amphibian can wait several winter months to eat. Okay, so you can think of it almost like if you, put a PS4 in rest mode, or like put a computer to sleep. It's still on. It's just barely using any power. so that it can last much longer without, receiving any kind of input. Okay, so let's talk about some specific amphibians. First, we got the salamander. That would be order Caudata. They are usually small and unremarkably colored, pretty plain, except for the giant salamander in Japan, which is 5 feet long. That's like taller than you guys, isn't it? Or maybe some of you. And the tiger salamander is also brightly colored, so that would be order Caudata, the salamanders. We also have usually no lungs in salamanders because 90% of their respiration is through their skin, and that means that they can spend a lot of time underwater. Okay, how about frogs and toads? That would be order Anura. So the frog has smooth, shiny skin that dries easily, so it needs to spend a lot of time in or near water. On the other hand, toads have dry, bumpy skin, and they just return to the water to reproduce. Okay, so those are the amphibians. Amphibians are a nice cross between fish and reptiles because they begin their life cycle in a fairly fish-like state, breathing with gills, in the particular case of frogs, actually being fish-like in its structure and swimming with fins. But then they metamorphose into an adult form which is suited to live on land. Now we have reptiles, another order of vertebrates who are entirely land-dwelling, of course, unless they spend a lot of time in the water like some do, which we'll see. But we still have to overcome the issue of the young developing in water. You see, fish eggs develop in water. They have a lot of moisture readily available to them for them to properly develop. Amphibian eggs develop in water. What about the reptile eggs? They don't lay their eggs in water, so how do they stay moist? We'll get to that. So, primary characteristics of reptiles. One, they are covered in tough, dry scales, which I think we're all pretty familiar with. It makes the skin feel cool, dry, and leathery. Scales also help to prevent water loss. They provide insulation by holding in warmth while they're sunning themselves. They get in all that warmth and the scales hold it in. But scales are not living tissue and they don't grow. It's kind of like your fingernails or your hair, where it is made of stuff that your body produces, but it itself isn't alive and it doesn't have blood vessels in it. It doesn't get bigger so much as your skin would make more of it. So that means that reptiles must periodically shed their skin. That's called molting, and then they'll grow a new one. New, larger scales will grow underneath before shedding the old one. Okay, something else about reptiles. Like fish and amphibians, they are ectothermic. They're cold-blooded. So since they have no internal mechanism to regulate their body temperature or warm themselves, they usually get some heat by sunning themselves on an open exposed rock in the sunlight. They do breathe with lungs. They don't have gills. There is no larval stage to metamorphose into a land-based lung breather. Since they don't have alternate methods of breathing like amphibians do through their skin or their mouth lining or whatever, reptile lungs are more efficient and have more capacity than amphibian lungs. Even marine reptiles breathe air with lungs. So sea turtles will need to come up. Sea iguanas will need to come up to breathe air. They also have a 3-chambered heart, although it's like a 3.5-chambered heart. Because if you remember, the amphibians had a left atrium and a right atrium, and then a ventricle. Well, the ventricle in a reptile heart is partially divided. Okay, so just follow this pattern, okay? Fish have a 2-chambered heart. Amphibians have a 3-chambered heart. Reptiles have a 3-chambered heart with one partially divided, so it's like 3.5, almost 4. How many chambers do our hearts have? Do you see the progression there? Okay, so let's talk about the reproduction of reptiles. I hinted earlier about eggs and retaining moisture. So reptiles will produce what are called amniotic eggs, covered with a leathery shell. Most of them are oviparous, although some are ovoviviparous. So what is an amniotic egg? An amniotic egg is a shelled, water-retaining egg that allows reptile, bird, and certain mammal embryos to develop on land. So that's how reptile eggs can develop on land but still stay moist. They just packed a water bottle. Okay? So in order to keep the egg and the embryo inside moist, they need to cover it in a shell that will retain that moisture. You see, fish and amphibians lay jelly-like eggs underwater, and amniotic eggs are able to reproduce this moist environment. So what are these eggs like? First, fertilization occurs inside the female, so this is internal fertilization. The developing zygote is encased in a protective shell, and the shell is porous enough to transmit air exchange, but not water flow. So it's watertight, but it's not airtight. This way, the developing embryo also has access to oxygen. Okay, so in an egg, there are 4 membranes: the amnion, the yolk sac, the allantois, and the chorion. So the amnion grows around the embryo, forming a fluid-filled sac in which the embryo floats. So Ziploc bag around the embryo. The yolk sac encloses the yolk, a clump of nutrients used to sustain the embryo during development. It's almost like a cotyledon, if you remember those, okay? The animal version of a cotyledon is a yolk, and that would be a membrane around that. This yolk is yellow, and during the development, the yolk and the yolk sac are absorbed by the developing embryo. Then we've got the allantois, which is a sac of blood vessels that allows for the respiration and excretion of the embryo, okay, to get oxygen in and carbon dioxide out and any waste that the embryo produces before it hatches. And then the chorion, which envelops all of the above structures, okay? So we've got, big package, the chorion, containing an amnion, a yolk sac, and an allantois. Okay. So the albumin is the white part of the egg, the part that we usually call the egg whites. This contains anti-pathogenic materials, so it's, a little antibacterial in there. It retains moisture, of course, keeping the environment of the egg to make sure it has enough water to sustain the growth of the embryo. It provides mechanical support for the chorion, and its contents absorbs shock and stores proteins. Very, very useful, keeping it moist, keeping it full of nutrition, and keeping it from shattering. Okay, so let's talk about some specific reptiles, and then we're done. So we've got order Testudines, which are turtles and tortoises. Turtles live in the water, tortoises live on land. That is a difference between them, although they both carry large shells on their back. Most members of this order can actually hide entirely inside their shell, though not all. Most of them have short, thick legs with 5 clawed toes, although, of course, others have flippers instead, like sea turtles. Their jaws form a tough beak, but they don't have any teeth. Their nostrils are up high on its snout, so it can breathe while mostly submerged. And most of the turtles and tortoises are fairly small, although there are some exceptions. For example, the hawksbill turtle weighs 270 pounds. The giant tortoise can weigh 500 pounds. And the leatherback sea turtle can weigh an amazing 1,500 pounds. Okay. So lizards and snakes are fairly similar to each other, and they're hard to tell apart, except for the fact that, of course, snakes have no legs. We think we can tell them apart, but if you had to actually describe the differences, most people can't get past legs, no legs. So lizards will have 2 pairs of limbs, whereas snakes have none. Lizards, though, have ears and they can hear. They don't have an external ear like we do, but they still do have an ear. Snakes are deaf. They cannot hear. Lizards have the same type of scale all over their bodies, whereas snakes have specialized scales on their belly for locomotion. Lizards, most of them have eyelids and can close their eyes, but snakes don't have eyelids and their eyes are always open, even when they sneeze. I'm just kidding. Anyway, let's talk about lizards. So a good example of a lizard would be iguanas. They're some of the largest reptiles. They can reach 4 to 6 feet. The green iguana lives in rainforest trees. The desert iguana lives in the desert. And marine iguanas live on the Galapagos Islands and eat seaweed. I mean, green in the forest, desert in the desert, marine in the water. They're well named. Okay, so another lizard worthy of note is the Komodo dragon. These are the largest lizards, and they can reach up to 10 feet. We've also got geckos. They rarely grow more than 9 inches. They have incredible climbing abilities due to these nanofibrous structures on the pads of their feet. These are a marvel of bioengineering, and they've been an inspiration for modern technology. Before we get out of the lizards, I do just want to put this out there. Lizards are also popular pets. If any of you have a pet lizard, like it's a bearded dragon or an iguana or whatever, why don't you send a picture to share? We can all admire your pet together. Okay, another common lizard are chameleons. Like geckos, they live in trees, and they're best known for their ability to change color. They shoot out a long tongue to catch insects. Another variety of lizards are horned toads. I know, toad sounds like it should be an amphibian, but in fact they're reptiles. They have a frightening defense. They're able to swell up, and that reveals spines on its head and its body. Okay, so it's like a pufferfish. Then the thing just shoots blood out of its eyes. Ugh. Yes, I kid you not. They can actually shoot blood like out of their eye. It's disgusting. Moving on. Gila monsters grow to be almost 2 feet long. They are the largest in the United States. They are the only poisonous lizard in the United States, and they live in the southwestern U.S., like around New Mexico and Arizona. The next group of reptiles up for discussion are snakes. So snakes have specialized scales on their bellies called scuties for locomotion. These scales have the ability to grasp the ground for traction. They also help a snake to wind around objects and branches as well. With the muscles in their body, they're able to wind themselves into like an S shape and coil up and then straighten out. Snakes are also able to swim, and there is a way that they're able to move called sidewinding, which desert snakes do because it makes it so that they have very little contact on the hot desert sand as possible while they're moving. So snakes are called order Squamata. Snakes are carnivorous. That means they feed on live prey like rodents, insects, lizards, eggs, even other snakes. They are not especially sharp-sighted, and they are also deaf. So how can they find anything? Well, for one, they can sense vibrations that travel through the ground. And they also have a unique olfactory sense, that is a sense of smell, that involves their tongue and an organ in their head called the Jacobson's organ. So let's take a look at that. They do have 2 nostrils on the front of their head that are connected to their olfactory lobes. So yes, they can smell through their nose, but when they flick their tongue out, it picks up particles in the air, and then it draws the tongue back into their mouth. Those particles are analyzed by what's called their Jacobson's organ, and that augments their sense of smell. Okay, so how do snakes hunt? Well, one way that they do it is by constriction, meaning that they wrap around something and they squeeze it to death by, asphyxiation, basically. They just deprive it of oxygen until it stops being alive. Snakes that do this would be ones like the anaconda, python, and boa constrictor. So these snakes are not poisonous. When they eat, their prey is swallowed whole. Their jaw isn't connected to their skull the way that ours is, which means that it's able to open much, much wider, enough to get an entire animal down that throat. And it's quite a sight. So there are some snakes that are famous, of course, for being poisonous, and it turns out that snakes make 2 types of poison. We've got a neurotoxin and a hemotoxin. Neurotoxins are poisons that attack the nervous system, causing blindness, paralysis, or suffocation. These act fast, but the other one is actually more deadly. They are poisons, hemotoxins, that attack the red blood cells and blood vessels, which throws off your circulation. These take longer to do damage, but they are deadlier by far. So there are two types of poisonous snakes. One have short, fixed fangs that deliver the poison while the snake is chewing on its prey. These predominantly produce neurotoxins, and they include the sea snake, coral snake, and the cobra. The other kind, though, have long fangs that fold away into pockets of the mouth when not in use. Typically, they produce hemotoxins. They can inject a large amount of poison in a single bite, and these are usually called vipers. These are common in Africa, Europe, and Asia. American pit vipers have another sense. They are somewhat sensitive to heat. They have heat-sensitive pits, kind of giving them like a heat vision. Examples of these would be water moccasins, copperheads, rattlesnakes, and the western diamondback. Okay, so we have another order of reptiles to consider. That would be order Crocodilia, the crocodiles and alligators. Whew. Everything in this list just is, it's not a fun time. Okay, so order Crocodilia. They are the largest reptiles today. Crocodiles can reach 30 feet long and 3,000 pounds. That's a ton and a half. So how to tell alligators from crocodiles? So alligators have short, blunt snouts, and when they close their mouths, all their teeth fit inside. Crocodiles, though, have a more pointy snout, and when they close their mouths, some of the teeth stick out. That's how you can tell the difference. Their eyes and their nostrils are at the tops of their heads so that they can remain mostly submerged in water and still be able to breathe and see. Makes them very good at ambushing out of the water. Okay, so about their reproduction. They lay eggs in a nest, so they are oviparous, and they cover it with rotting vegetation. This compost actually produces heat that is going to incubate these eggs. Did you know that compost produces heat? Any decomposition produces heat. When the young hatch, they make this cute little peeping sound, and then their mother comes and digs them out and takes them to the water. Oh, isn't that nice? No, wait, no, we can't think this is cute. These are killer crocodiles, and then babies make a little peeping sound, and their mommy takes them to the water. Nope. No. You feel about them how you like. I think it's kind of cool. All right, so there's one more order of reptiles, and then we're through. That would be order Rhynchocephalus. That one, yeah, Rhynchocephalus. That order contains many extinct reptiles and some dinosaurs. It only contains one living reptile, the Tautara. The Tautara lives in New Zealand, so we may not know much about it, but it can live for 60 years. Doesn't reproduce until it's 20, and its egg takes a year to develop before hatching. That's quite an extended lifespan. It grows to 30 inches long and eats insects and has spines on its back. And most notably, it has a third eye. It's called a parietal eye, and it's actually covered in scales, but it's still hooked up to the brain. All right, well, that is a survey of reptiles. I do want to make mention of something because when we talk about largest reptiles, or when we mention here that this order contains some dinosaurs, we might be tempted to think that dinosaurs belong in this section because they must be reptiles. And while it is true that dinosaurs share a lot of characteristics with the reptiles that we've talked about, to classify them in this order is really not correct. I'm sorry, this order in this class is not really correct, because the reptiles in this class, lizards and snakes and crocodiles, turtles, these lived alongside of dinosaurs. These already had existed at that time, which means that these are not descendants of dinosaurs. These are cousins of dinosaurs, which survived the Cretaceous extinction. So while they may have similarities with them, such as having scales on their skin, or various different kinds of body shapes, they don't really belong in this group. They belong in their own group, and so we just want to beware of applying semi-scientific descriptions like reptile. That's really more of a zoo category than a biological category. We want to beware of applying those categories to things which bear superficial resemblance rather than actually being in a lineage of descent. All right, well, that's the end of reptiles. After this, we just have birds and mammals, but that will be next.